Welcome to the 3Haunted podcast, where we bring you all things horror, supernatural, folklore, mythology, and all things that go bump in the night.
What's up, everybody? This is your co host, Ashley Lunar Goddess, Gorilla Girl filmmaker and horror loving cinephile. I'm just your average podcast producing badass.
I'm BJ Sewura, an aspiring paranormal musician who plays live for the dead because the living just doesn't want to hear me.
What's up, ghouls, gals, and metapals? The circle is cast, the candles have been lit. In today's episode, we'll be diving into the historical and modern world of witchcraft with a very special returning guest, Houngan James.
Thanks for having me back. I really enjoyed the last time I was on, so I've been looking forward to coming back to you guys again.
I really enjoyed when you were on, so I'm glad that when I reached out and it's like, hey, you want to come back? We'd love to have you back. You were on board.
Absolutely, without a second thought. It's just for the benefit of your listeners. The first episode I did, of course, I talked about Haitian voodoo, which is a prime practice for me, and that's where my title Houngan comes from. But happily, spiritual systems like this are not exclusive. So you can have additional practices alongside, as long as we don't blend them. Witchcraft has actually been a practice of mine that's been in my life longer than Haitian voodoo has, going back to the wild days of 1989.
So I will say, because I know you touched on that in the last episode, your background in researching a lot of the different spiritual practices. I did have a listener come to me and say that you are by far one of our best guests that they've listened to. They have re-listened to your episode multiple times. They just found the way you approach spirituality very informative, a lot of like an academic perspective behind it, but also just you explain it in a way that makes sense to those who aren't involved in that world. So just wanted to give you that feedback.
I very much appreciate that. And I think it's important that when we talk about practices like this, we have to have an awareness of the accessibility of it. It would be easy for me to come on and do the sort of verbal equivalent of people capitalizing every third word and adding extra E's on the end of words like craft and art to give that edginess. But that does very, very little to kind of give people insight or give any kind of real sense of what goes on behind the scenes in these traditions. And really, that's what we're here for, is exploration. So I do appreciate that feedback very much, and I hope your listener enjoys this episode every bit as much.
I'm sure they will. And I will say, on top of what you said, what I find personally that I love about the way you approach these very big, expansive topics with us is that you don't approach it as like an authoritarian, someone who is, the gatekeeper of this knowledge. I feel like you do provide this information in a way that you really truly are trying to educate and share and welcome people into this world.
I think that's hits on an important point too, and that's what we call mysteries with a capital M. And that comes up quite a bit in Western occult lodges, Western forms of witchcraft, and then in other languages about other spiritual paths. And those mysteries with a capital M are things that cannot be explained, right? You cannot describe those things to another person. What happens is they're experiential. So, take, for example, the idea of color. If you're trying to describe color to a person who was born without sight, has never seen color, you cannot capture the sensory experience of seeing color. You can try and approximate it by saying, for example, red is hot, blue is cold. But blue is also sky. Red is also roses. There's no way to gather that sensory data and explain it to somebody who's never seen it. So with these magical and spiritual and mystical traditions and paths, the mysteries with a capital M are something that has to be unpacked, that has to be experienced in order to be understood. But that's only part of what these traditions do. There are still practices and beliefs and rites and ceremonies and so on that can be talked about and described. So I think it's important for us to give an overview of what we're able to give, with the understanding that there are deeper cores that we can't actually describe, not out of gatekeeping, but out of a lack of a common reference point. Right, so people have to experience these things in order to have that frame of reference with which to discuss. So I try to elucidate as much as I can on what's easily to discuss or easily discussed.
That makes complete sense.
So, how do you get into something like this? Because you said you started in the 80s. Is that correct?
That's right. 1989, I was all of 14 years old. And I started off, as so many people did, with the very neo-pagan forms of witchcraft that were available at the time. You found books, um, and you read what you could, and you decided to try out this ceremony or that ceremony. And I did that for a while. And gradually, a neo-pagan and witch community started building up in the area where I live. So I got in touch with other people. Some folks have been doing it a bit longer, learned things, learned more. Got into practicing with specific groups from specific traditions. Um, so within the sphere of neo-pagan witchcraft are two broad streams. One is an initiatory order of priesthood, and its initiation is passed down person to person. There's training, there's secrets that are kept within that are kind of in secrets, the same way Freemasons may have or anything else. And then the other stream is broadly eclectic, where it's a very do-it-yourself form of spirituality. And these two streams are very different. You know, the lineage traditions sometimes get called the Jesuits of witchcraft, because they tend to focus very much on scholarship, um, understanding the historical roots of what they do. Whereas the more eclectic side tends to be more about what you feel, what you're drawn to. So they're quite different. But I went through the lineage traditions for a while, and then at that point moved away from them into what we call traditional witchcraft, which is less so a spiritualized religion that happens to involve witchcraft, and more so the actual magical practice. That would be more akin to peddlers in Eastern England, cunning men or cunning women, they were also called. So um, less of the craft in terms of movies, and more of Midsummer or films more like that, where it's grittier and grungier. So those things have moved alongside Haitian voodoo with me, and it took a little while to find a balance between the two. Strictly because in both traditions we accept the existence of spirits not as metaphors for aspects of psychology or metaphors for personality, but as living actual beings, with their own independent existence, wants, needs, and so on. So you try to find a balance between make sure everybody's needs are met.
Being that you are where you are geographically, how did you find the information to access the traditional lineages? Was it difficult or was it actually kind of really accessible around you?
It wasn't too difficult. There were some people who were involved in those traditions, who were fairly close to me. So I was lucky enough that there happened to be a presence that I could take advantage of. Later on, as I moved away from those particular groups, but still within the same traditions, the internet was in existence by then. So by the late 90s, early 2000s, I was able to make contact with folks in other parts of Canada or in other parts of the eastern US. And then it was a simple matter of hopping on a plane or hopping behind the wheel and going to visit. So the internet actually, for a lot of spiritual traditions, did a really good job of helping people find each other, helping people connect. It's also been a bane because it has a lot of misinformation and poor information to spread like wildfire as well. So I always tell people, if I'm teaching or training them, that the most important thing you can learn in your early days of training, be it Haitian voodoo, be it witchcraft, is discernment. Because there's a lot of garbage out there, and you need to be able to parse through everything and find out what's legitimate information, what informs your practice well, what works and achieves results, and what doesn't. And you need to have the ability to discard the dross that's there. Even if you feel emotionally connected to it, if it's not working for you, it's got to go.
Now, in terms of discernment, because we hear that quite often when it comes to metaphysical practices, be it witchcraft or other practices, when we use that word discernment, how exactly is one able to discern? Is it really just like you said, what's informing your craft, or are there other things people can do to help assist with that discernment?
Well, in most of these traditions, there are divination systems that are available. Tarot is a very well-known one, but playing cards can be used as well. All the mancies, pyromancy, which is divination through fire. You can watch with birds if that's a particular gift you have. Smoke, the flame of a candle, trance work. So a good thing is you think of it as a computer's operating system. You may be on an Apple computer, somebody else may be on a Windows computer. So the keystrokes Control Alt Delete will do something on a Windows computer, usually make you curse at Bill Gates. But on an Apple computer, that keystroke doesn't do anything. So the metaphor here being some things fit into a system, they operate within the confines of that system, and when you examine them, they make sense. Other things don't. And so discernment helps you decide what is what. So to give you an example, traditionally out of England, magical groups have associated east with the element of air, south with fire, west with water, north with earth, which from the geographical setting of southern England makes total sense. However, if you're here where I am in eastern Canada, why would I look to the west, which is the bulk of North America, and associate that with elemental water? Why would I look to the east, which is the wide expanse of the Atlantic, and associate that with air? So when you have a sense of discernment, you're looking at the pieces of your practice and what's in your tradition and wondering why the things are there. You start to realize that doesn't match up with the Southern English perspective, so you adjust it. And you rearrange the directional association of elements to something that suits your geography. And that's a huge focus that exists in traditional witchcraft as well, where it's about the spirit of place, the spirits of where you are, the land where you are, becomes fundamentally important. So with that as well, we see as other traditions start to gain a lot of track online, or they become popular. Things like currently conjure and hoodoo and root work are deep South African American traditions that have kind of exploded in recent years in public consciousness. If you have a witch living where I live here in Nova Scotia, and they're looking to do a particular kind of work and they're researching it online, somebody may say, you need devil's shoestring. That's a particular plant. Or you need this plant or this plant that's used in conjure. Well, it doesn't really help your work much to have to order plants from 3,000 miles away to be shipped up to you when nature provides. So being connected with the land around you means you watch the plants. You see how plants function, what they do, how they grow, and you can find something near you that will do everything. So to give a classic example, dandelions are often used as a wish granting thing. Some traditions say you dig up a dandelion root, you prepare it, you can make a wish on it and use that to achieve what you want. But if you pay attention to dandelions, you see that there is not a small crack in a sidewalk anywhere that those things won't grow through. They will find their way to break through anything. So that tells you they're good at breaking through things, which means when you have what we call blockbuster work, which is breaking down barriers, problems in your life, things that are holding you back, a dandelion actually works very well for that. Another plant we have that grows locally is called a lupin. Beautiful flowers, but they sprout up, they bloom, and they're gone in 2 weeks. But if you have one lupin in your yard this year, you'll have 20 next year, you'll have 95 the next year, you'll have 300 after that, they spread. So you can gather those petals from lupins and use them in any kind of magical work you want to increase something or to multiply something, because that's the nature of the plant. You find these things out by observing them. And that's where discernment factors into that as well. Is it better to use something from 3,000 miles away you've never dealt with, or better to use what is in your yard, what is in the trees and the forest near you, right? And that discernment then helps function kind of like a spiritual immune system. What belongs to the work that you're doing, or what doesn't belong to the work that you're doing, and then set a dividing line that way.
Yeah, it sounds like just discernment really helps you make your practice more adaptable and dynamic versus staying the static thing that just is rigid over time, which makes complete sense.
That's very true. A lot of folks like to take recipes. In any tradition I've been involved with, be it witchcraft or Haitian voodoo, you'll often have a recipe for, a bath in Haitian voodoo, a spiritual bath to add something to somebody or to take something away. Or you may have packets that we make. Same thing within witchcraft, different objects. But when we're really getting down to understanding the person we're working for, the client we're working for, they're an individual human being with an individual context connected to their familial, social, and economic spheres, their ancestral background. None of us is the same. We're all unique. And if you're dealing with a practitioner who's experienced, you'll find that the recipes flex and change. Maybe an ingredient's left out, a new one's put in, something substituted for something else. Work is done a bit differently because it needs to address the individual context of the person. Sticking to recipes, just to buy the book Betty Crocker Witchcraft doesn't really cut it. Not if you're trying to get real success. And discernment helps with that as well.
Well, yeah, I think about just allergies, right? If we treat everything as a one-stop shop or a one-stop, hey, take this root or this mushroom, like for me, myself specifically, I actually can't have anything mushroom related. And oftentimes, you hear about like the mushroom teas, and right now it's very trendy. Mushroom is in everything, and it's just like, I can't consume that. But really understanding that while a root or a plant or anything like that might have really good properties in and of itself, it's not going to be a one stop for everybody. It's not going to help everybody, and not everybody can consume it or work with it.
Right, and we see this in the medical community as well, where penicillin is a very, very common thing to use. But some people have a deathly allergy to penicillin. They can't use it. It can't be exposed to it. So you have to be able to flex with that to move into the context of that individual who has a penicillin allergy. So it's not limited to witchcraft, of course, that idea. Even cooking, cooking falls into it as well. If you're cooking food and you know that your guest eats a lot of hot, spicy food, you may make a particular dish a lot spicier than you normally would. It suits their palate where they're used to heat, so it requires more heat. But the next day you have somebody coming over and you're cooking the same dish, and that person thinks mayonnaise is spicy. You're certainly going to leave the habaneros out. You're going to leave the Carolina Reapers out. You may tone it down a little bit. The food that you're preparing is the same, but the way you spice it has to vary based on the tastes of the person.
Oh no, we're going trial by fire.
That's certainly fair enough. You can separate the wheat.
Now you're saying that people, you practice different things in different areas with different ingredients. Do you have people coming to your area for specific things that you guys have locally? Is that something that's a draw? And what are those things?
Not as much. I find people these days are more focused on going to warmer parts of the continent and looking for things from the deep south or things from the Caribbean because that's the popular traditions these days. I do have some folks I know further in the south who will approach me and ask, "Can you get bloodroot, for example, which grows abundantly here, or birch twigs?" Because there's a use for birch in specific witchcraft ceremonies. Things like that that are more centered up here in this part of the country. I just find there's less of those requests than there are people seeking things from the deep south. But it does happen.
Now, in terms of the traditions and lineages of the history of witchcraft, one can say witchcraft has, which I'm sure you have researched just way much more than this, but uh, witchcraft in its different iterations has been emergent in so many cultures. For you, when you talk about the history of witchcraft, which context are you speaking to?
So that's a very good question. And it's an important one. It's one I have a lot of debates and discussions about. When I say witchcraft, I'm referring specifically to Western Europe, and even more specifically to the United Kingdom. The reason for that being these things have cultural context, right? Witchcraft, or what we would call witchcraft in Britain, is not the same thing as what might be called witchcraft in Africa or witchcraft is a Eastern Europe because the cultures are different. Um, in France, they would talk about sorcery, right? Sorcery, witchcraft. In Spain, they would say brujeria, witchcraft. But even though those terms translate to witchcraft in English, Spanish culture is not the same as the British. British is not the same as the French, and vice versa. So there are variations. This is one thing that came out of the church is that by putting an overall interpretation of what the idea of witchcraft was, Satan and his little minions, um, being the Catholic perspective on it, they did impose sort of a church-based view of what witchcraft is over all of it. But that's not necessarily a true interpretation based on what people on the ground are doing, the actual practitioners, most of whom don't have any truck with Satan, have nothing to do with that sort of side of the church and church beliefs. Um, but when I talk about witchcraft, unless otherwise stated, I'm referring to specifically around Britain and Western Europe.
With the historical point that you utilize for your practice of that specific origin source, do you find that you still carry those traditions and lineages with your current practice, or with your advancement into, or not advancement, but your including the Haitian voodoo, has that evolved into something completely different?
Well, it functions differently for me. So the lineage traditions I was practicing, Gardnerian, witchcraft, and so on, are less important to me. They still have a dear place in my heart, but those particular sets of rites and ceremonies are coven based. They're not for solitary practitioners. They do require a group to work. Um, and they're not focused heavily on magic. Magic is present there, but they're celebratory. They're mystical, but not so much magical. So because I don't work in a coven context, not often anymore, that is more by the wayside. It does inform my beliefs and personal philosophies, but not so much my practice. Haitian voodoo is what takes on the spiritual side of things for me. That gives me context, gives me an interpretive framework to approach the world and how I understand it from that point of view. And it is a lot more involved in magic. Then outside of Haitian voodoo, which is also community based, excuse me, when it comes to traditional witchcraft, that is very much available for the solitary practitioner, an individual to work on their own, um, to work between them, spirits of the land, and so on. So the way my current practice looks is Haitian voodoo is a large portion of it, but you could think of that as the religion side with quite a bit of magic, and then my personal witchcraft project practices a lot of magic with a little bit of religion. So they're like a Venn diagram. I don't mingle the practices at all. They're completely separate, and they need to be completely separate. Um, but they provide a meeting point in how my particular life works or how I revolve around them. Um, and it's been an interesting thing to navigate. But excuse me, but having found the meeting place between them and the balance between them, I just find my life is richer for having both.
When you were first adapting them into your life to be these parallel running practices, did you find any points of conflict, or were you able to integrate them in alongside one another kind of fairly easily?
Well, um, points of conflict, not really, just because they're kept separate. If one was trying to merge them, I'd be like trying to merge basketball and hockey. How do you mix those two together, right? Are you going to wear sneakers or skates? Are you shooting hoops or are you shooting a puck? Those that would be difficult, but you keep the two sports separate. It's easier to manage. The main thing has been time management. I have spirits within the Haitian voodoo tradition that I serve on each particular day. Um, so then you come to a day where there's witchcraft spirits that may serve as a full moon, it's a new moon, what have you. And I have things I need to do. How do I juggle time around a day job, around being a father, having dogs? How do I fit all this in and still make sure that I'm honoring spirits of different traditions? So that took a bit of time to sort out, a bit of time to work out. But that's less about the traditions and more about my own failings as an imperfect human who wants to be able to do all the things, but still wants to have time to sit on my butt and just zone out.
And watch scary movies?
Watch scary movies,
I
exactly. Which
remember.
brings me to a question for you guys. Since we're on the topic, because I always associate you guys with horror movies and horror subculture, right?
I love that
Since we're on the
association.
topic of witchcraft, what are your guys' favorite witchcraft or occult-based horror movies?
Oh, that's so good. Oh. BJ, you go because I got to think about that.
I got a couple. So we just recently watched Penny Dreadful, and with Penny Dreadful, there's some witchcraft involved in there. There's a couple subplots that are really really good that I really enjoy. Um, and Agatha All Along, which is also it's more of a, I mean it's enjoyable, but it's, I don't know how, it's it for entertainment. I don't know if it really follows any kind of specific tradition, because it is kind of, a Marvel thing. It's not necessarily any kind of based in real magic or practices. But I mean, The Craft for me is probably one of my favorites. But these aren't all. I mean, none of. I don't think it. I mean, are they horror? I don't know. Are witchcraft movies with witchcraft, are they considered horror? A subgroup
I
maybe.
feel like they would be.
It's always a shifting line. What's horror?
Yeah, I feel like most witchcraft movies would be. I'm trying to think. Probably The Littlest Witch probably is not, but but I feel like a good portion of the ones that we get, especially through mainstream, are likely going to be under the horror umbrella. I think for me, The Old Ways is a solid one that sticks with me. That wasn't very mainstream. I don't think it went to theaters at all, but it's based more on like brujeria and the curanderas, and really phenomenal one that ties into that practice. And I'm trying to think, what are some other ones? I can't even think. I'm blanking on witchcraft movies and occult movies.
Find I find a lot of the good witchcraft ones these days connect into folk horror, the whole folk horror genre. So you have that Midsommar
Yes.
is absolutely phenomenal. But one that's close to my heart, which maybe not fall into horror by modern reckoning, but I think it did in '73, was the old original Wicker Man.
Oh, yeah.
Um, what was very interesting about that movie was they took everything we knew about ancient beliefs and they actually wove in some elements of magical theory into it, consciously or unconsciously. So you have Sergeant Howie, of course, goes on out to the island, and spoilers for anybody who hasn't seen it, but it came out in '73, so tough. Um, when he burns in the Wicker Man at the end, he has been given every opportunity per these ancient mythological cycles to not be the victim. You know, the victim's supposed to be virginal, so they send the landlord's daughter to him. They have a whole song about it, going up to him to try and seduce him. And of course, he turns away from that, right? So he loses that opportunity and so on and so forth. He's always given every chance to save himself and doesn't. And those things play into old legends and old stories and even modern legends and stories about the idea of the sacrifice king and the sacred king giving his life for the land. So watching that and knowing that it was filmed in '73, and of course it had Christopher Lee in it, so you know it's going to be good, hopefully. Um, even watching that from the point of view of years and decades of magical practice, I see the elements that are woven into it intentionally to be there. So there's a subtext to the film that speaks to experienced practitioners that may not be there for younger practitioners or newer practitioners who haven't experienced certain things or haven't realized certain things about how these traditions work. And one of those things is sacrifice. So in Haitian voodoo, animal sacrifice does exist. Uh, in older forms of witchcraft, it certainly existed. We don't see that in a lot of witchcraft today, although people may offer their own blood in witchcraft ceremonies. Um, just culturally, we've shifted away from that. And I think a lot of that comes along with the fact that we are not as plugged into cycles of life and death as our ancestors were. How many of us have gone out and slaughtered our own meat for supper? You know, in today's world. Most of the time we go down to the supermarket, we buy the prepackaged chicken or the beef that's already been bled. It's been butchered, it's been bled, it's been ground down, it comes in a styrofoam wrap with a bit of plastic on it. We're cut away from those cycles of life and death that to our ancestors were vital. You know, a bad harvest meant you starved to death in the winter. You know, you didn't have the ability to go to a store and just, you know, buy your food. Um, Death was close to you. And so in magical practice, the acceptance of blood sacrifice is far more common in cultures that aren't advanced in the sense that the West is advanced in terms of access to technology and so on, strictly because we're cut off from death. And the viscerality, the realness of in your face death isn't something that we face every day anymore. But then, of course, we compensate by going to horror movies, you know, where death is a common thing. The blood flows, right? The scariness is there because there's still a draw in us as human beings to want that that experience of being frightened, that experience of being scared. Just like the founding members of Black Sabbath said, you know, when they sat there trying to think of a name for their band, they watched people lining up to go see the old Boris Karloff movie, Black Sabbath. They said, why do people pay to be scared? But we can do that with music. And they created the entire genre of heavy metal. Right. So it's interesting the cultural impact that has on magical practice, right?
Yeah, it is interesting too that the despite us having, and actually it might be in spite of it, of having increased longevity and this lifespan that has gotten longer, the more technology and the more we've increased as, communities and populations, our fear of death and our own mortality has gotten higher. Back when it was truly like survival mode, and like you said, you're having to hunt for your food or you're going to die. It was the spiritual idea that you just accepted. Death was a part of it. And as we've lived longer and increased our longevity and lifespan, we have such an increased heightened fear of death.
And you're right about that. You look at how we approach end of life care. In the modern West, we will do anything we can to prolong life. We will keep people on ventilators, people who are well past having lost their minds to dementia, Alzheimer's, and we keep them alive as long as we can because of that fear of death, that lack of acceptance of death. Um, and we go to the point where we don't care about quality of life anymore. My own father succumbed to dementia. He died from dementia. And I saw him, I cared for him towards the end of his life, and he wasn't him anymore. He didn't really recognize people anymore, didn't have much memory, was non-communicative. And you sit there and you say, why are we prolonging this man's life? He had always been clear throughout his life. He never wanted to be in this state, right? So why are we allowing this to continue? Why do we prolong life out of a fear of death so long that we don't care about the quality of life anymore? And I think that's something that we've lost from not staring death in the face as part of our daily life anymore. We've lost the concept of what a good death is. And we tend to look at every death as a loss. Even in the medical community, medicine tends to see a death as a loss. Somebody dies in a surgery, there's a car accident, they don't make it through emergency or up to surgery, they don't make it through the surgery. The whole stereotype of the doctor pounding the stretcher with his fist, it never gets any easier. Well, death is a natural part of life, right? If we did not fight against that, we didn't push back against that, and we accepted the fact that sometimes death is the better option, rather than living in incredible pain, allowing somebody to go because it's the right time. I think we would be better off as a culture.
That reminds me of Midsummer when they're doing the ritual. I don't know how to pronounce it, but the Atastupa ceremony, when the two elders have reached that age of 72 and they jump off the cliff and they try to explain to them, no, this is actually a great honor. We all do this at that age. And not saying that's right, but just this idea of not being afraid of death, and death it can be an honor. It's not necessarily something to be afraid of or mourn or grieve. It maybe, I mean, granted, that was also kind of a interesting cult there, but the idea that it can be an honor.
Right, and we certainly don't want to downplay the fact that we miss the people who have died.
Right.
We miss people who have gone beyond. But when I talked earlier about how the lineage witchcraft traditions, there's a deep spirituality to it, dealing with the mysteries. It's been said that the ancient mysteries, there was mystery schools, as they were called in Greece and in other places, where you were presented spiritual truths in dramatized form or in ritual form, things that you had to in order to start to learn them. Part of that is the idea of being able to face death. The fear of death is something that's part of all of us. And the idea was to understand the true nature of death, the true purpose of death, and to be able to stand there and face it and not be afraid. To know that when our end comes, it is just simply part of the process. You don't start a race with no plan to ever cross the finish line. By the same token, we don't live without ever expecting that we're never going to die, because we will. Excuse me. So part of the spiritual side of that is an understanding and an apprehension of that death that will come one day, and being able to meet it with pride, being able to meet it with dignity. And those lineage traditions of witchcraft, the central story is called the legend of the descent of the goddess. And the idea is the goddess has descended into the underworld because everything dies, and she wants to solve that mystery. And she comes before death, the mighty one. And as she's going through gates further into the underworld, she's stripped of everything. Leave your crown, leave your jewels, your sandals, your gown, everything, right? Because you can bring nothing into the realm of death. She comes before death, and she asks him why he causes everything she loves to wither and die. And he says, it's not me. I don't do any of this. It's age and it's fate. None of us are beyond age and fate. But I give peace and freedom at the end of things, and the opportunity for rebirth. So she is experiencing that mystery. And when you go through the initiatory ceremonies of these particular traditions, that's what you're doing, is you're taking her role and you're going through her story, so that you yourself are facing these truths and facing these consequences. So you have the ability to learn, to understand what death is, to face those things. People call it shadow work today, but you're facing those deeper parts of yourself that, people like Carl Jung have talked about for forever. the shadow and the fear within yourself, to rob it of its strength and power by no longer letting it enslave you, no longer being a slave to that fear and integrating that energy back into yourself. So that's the spiritual side that comes from those traditions. They don't have much to do with the practice of magic, but they do have quite a bit to do with the spiritual growth and development that is often a precursor to effectively working magic.
There's just so much that I don't know about it that I've heard from, because I talked to a couple friends about it today. I was saying, we're gonna have a podcast today. We're gonna talk about all these traditions and everything, and it's hard for a lot of people to really, I guess, step outside of what they think they know what it is to accept it. And I don't know if that's something that you deal with much. It's kind of a tangent, right? But if there are people that you deal with these days, because maybe it's more acceptable now, but just the stigma of being in the past connected to Satan and negative things, whereas a lot of the things today are very positive, and it's to help people. Um, how you deal with that kind of the people that don't know, like, what we do, how do you help them understand?
Well, a big thing to do is what we did earlier, which is defining the term. When you guys asked me when I talk about witchcraft, what am I talking about? And I said, Western Europe and so on. We have to define the term, because as much as modern witchcraft practitioners may not want to accept it or like it, in popular culture and the popular imagination for 600 or 700 years, the word witchcraft has been intimately tied to the devil and to Satanism as a foil to the church, because that's what the Christian belief in witchcraft is. It doesn't matter what the reality of the practice is. We've had 700 years of the idea that the Salem witch trials happened, the witch burnings throughout Western Europe, witch trials in Eastern Europe. There's application of the word witch to everybody you hated, so they'd be gone and you could get their land. But that intimate tie to the devil has been there. So modern practitioners like to very much distance themselves from it, but they forget that we're trying to overcome 700 years of practice. The other flip side, or seven, not of practice, 700 years of cultural association. But the flip side to that as well is nobody has a copyright on the term witch. So everybody's interpretation of what may be witchcraft or may not is different. So it becomes difficult to kind of set a course that applies to everybody. We have modern folks who practice very much a form of spirituality that they call Satanism. They put it in opposition to the church. Sometimes it's atheistic, like with the Temple of Satan, where their whole idea is to be a protest organization and to push back against hypocrisy in society, but with no real belief structure. Then you have other groups that are theistic Satanism, who believe Satan is an actual being and they're pushing against Christianity. And we as witchcraft practitioners can't stop them from using the term witch to self-describe, which many of them do. Drawing on that 700 years of cultural association. So it does become difficult to try and speak to people about aspects of witchcraft when you do have not only 700 years of this belief structures to overcome, but also the fact that we can point to modern practitioners who self-identify in that way, but who revel in that 7th-century old association with Satanism in opposition to the church. So it gets difficult. So usually, I think the best thing we can do is to live our lives right and let our characters and the way we conduct ourselves be the best example we can give.
Since it has become a term that has expanded in terms of the definition because other people and groups have embodied it, is it then just when someone is approaching you to say, this is what my practice of witchcraft looks like, this is what the history of witchcraft and lineage that I follow is, anything outside of that is for others, whoever defined that as, to go into?
Well, for me, it's baby steps. If somebody knows nothing about what I do and they come and they ask me about it, I'm going to spoon feed them little bits at a time, because there needs to be context for it, right? So if they come and say, do you worship Satan? No, I don't worship Satan. Not at all. Say, okay, that's the place we can start. But if they were to come into the room where I do my ceremonies and that stuff, they're going to see things that Hollywood has taught them are signs of devil worship. They're going to see a goat skull sitting there. And immediately that's going to say to them, there's the devil, right? Or they may see animal bones or animal parts or things like that that are present. Or they may see, a little black iron cauldron. They may see a sword. They may see a knife. And they don't have the tools yet to understand what these things are there for. So I start off with, no, I don't worship the devil. And then in later conversations, we could talk about venerating the spirit of animals, or, a deer carries a certain energy with it, of deerness, as it were, or a wolf carries a certain energy. And you could kind of liken that to the way indigenous practices work, where a shaman may have a deer bow because he's calling upon the spirit of the deer, spirit of the wolf, and so on. So another bit of spoon feeding goes on. And gradually you have to kind of ease somebody into the context of what it is you do so they can approach it in a way rooted more in understanding and curiosity than of that visceral fear. Saying, my God, there's a goat skull. This guy is like a Venom album cover. I just cannot be dealing with him, right? So that is part of it. A lot of folks have done a lot of work to try and approach witchcraft in a very much witches don't hurt anybody. It's just a neo-pagan religion sort of approach. Um, but the unfortunate side to that is it tends to water down what witchcraft is. It's like watering it down into invalid food, easy to digest, suitable for everybody, which really casts away the essentially subversive nature of witchcraft. The fact that we are calling on spirits, sitting there, we are lighting these candles in the dark, we are howling under the full moon, we are doing things a lot of folks would think are just absolutely ridiculous and out of pocket. Um, but we run the risk of sacrificing what's really visceral and what's really effective and what's really raw about witchcraft when we try to water it down to make it palatable to people who aren't even practicing it anyway.
Now, you brought up the goat skull, and pop culture has definitely created the association between the goat and Baphomet. And so, can we
Yeah,
get
live
some
deliciously.
can we get some clarification in terms of what exactly does the goat skull in your practice represent? Not that I'm accusing you. I just like people hear that and like you said, they automatically see the goat and they're like, it's the devil. So let's clarify.
Right. Right. I love how you put the south spin on the devil. Clarify.
The
Yeah.
devil.
Um, so I have a ritual tool called a stang, and a stang is a sort of staff. And it's forked at the top, whether it's naturally forked or whether it's you have an iron set of horns or whatever they go on it. Um, and a skull gets lashed to it. This goat skull is lashed. Some people use a ram skull and so on. The idea of that being lashed to it is nothing to do with the devil, but it is to do with the wildness. It is to do with certain spirits that we serve in witchcraft, land spirits. If you think about spirits of the land, they're always horned animals. They may be moose, elk, deer. They can be goats. They can be rams, what have you. But there's something primal about our connection to horned animals. We fed ourselves when we were hunter gatherers very much from deer and animals like that. Once we started farming, we became agricultural people. Cows have horns, you know, little ones. Bulls have horns. Rams have horns. There is a connection to the cycle of life and death that sits there. Part of the thing with traditional witchcraft, and here's where it spins out a little crazy too, is the word devil does get used, but it's not referring to Satan. It's talking about wilder spirits that are not connected with Christianity, spirits that may be living out in the countryside, spirits of the crossroads. And they were called devil by country people because, in the same way, I might say that guy's a cheeky devil, right? Or devilishly handsome. We have ways of using the term devil that don't reference Satan. But if you think about yourself as a country practitioner, your education is very much not a formal education. It's the wisdom of the land, farmer's wisdom, common stuff, right? Um, the church is sitting there telling you all about this creature out there in the darkness who'll grant you wishes and do all this stuff for you, right? And lead you astray. And yet you have local legends about this being, the Buka or the Puka, or depending where in Britain you are, different names. Who lives out there in the heath, lives out there in the forest who can grant you these things. It's easy to just apply the term devil. But when you read the writings of these practitioners, anywhere from Michael Howard, Gemma Gary, these other British witches, they make it very clear they're not talking about Satan. So then it becomes a little bit of a minefield because we do have that skull present with the horns, right? It does have a purpose that connects directly to witchcraft. Um, but we have to navigate carefully about how we explain it because there is a little bit of overlap between peasant superstitions involving the Christian devil versus these magical spirits of land and place. Um, and you find that throughout legends in England, in Western Europe, even in North America. I mean, who has ever lived in a town in North America that doesn't have something named after the devil? That's the Devil's Creek, Devil's Wood, Devil's Path. You know, people love to call things devil this and devil that. Um, but quite often they get those names because there's some connection to magical power of the land there, you know. And if you're not a practitioner of witchcraft, and you're a card carrying Christian, if it's not Jesus, it's the devil. There's no categorization there. You know, there's no concept that there can be many different types of spiritual beings who have different roles and who maybe haven't chosen a side in this God versus the devil thing, or unaffiliated, as George Clooney's character put it in Oh Brother Right Thou. So there's a complexity to our dealings with the spiritual world, and this is one of those reasons why things like a goat skull, we have to ease people into them because they may have an association with it that isn't necessarily matching the reality. But the goat skull, to answer your question initially, is there because it represents specific spirits and it also represents a visceral, raw, and primal part of our connection to the natural world around us. Not just because of the horns, but because it's a skull. And I don't think, a human being on the planet who would see a skull and not think death and that connection. I mean, it's a skull,
So not the devil. So
not the devil.
not the devil. I grew up in the South, so it's not obvious.
Well, and that's it. You know, I've spent a lot of time in the South, chiefly Alabama, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Um, Now I can go out here in the woods near my house and go do spiritual work and know that it's very rare somebody's going to stumble across me. But if somebody did, there might be chatter around the town. There was some guy in a robe with a mask on, and he had a skull on a pole. What the hell was that? And there might be some talk for a little while. But if I was out in, central Alabama and somebody stumbled across that,
Bama.
man, they're coming. There's going to be a truckload of people with pitchforks looking for me real quick.
They're gonna get you.
They're going to get me.
What initially drew you into the space of witchcraft? Because I know you said that was back in the 80s, but what was that initial draw?
It was a sense of truth. I came from a family where my parents were Catholic from Quebec. They were French Catholic, but they were non-practicing Catholics. Baptized me as a baby because that's what you did, but that was it. We never went to church. We weren't doing any of that. And I started reading these books about witchcraft and the spirits of the land. I was that kid who consumed Greek mythology. You know, had my favorite dinosaur at 6 and my favorite Greek god at 7, right? And would argue the merits of both for you. Um, but started reading these things where these mythological things, the elegance of these myths, the sheer glory of these myths and these stories embodied in the land, talking about Greek gods and Olympus, and then moving on to different cultures and their myths and their mythological characters, and realizing that there was something real about this. It wasn't just stories. You could, these are spirits of the land, spirits of wood and stream and water, and spirits of tree and spirits of stone, spirits of the sea. And really this very animistic thing that rang in my heart and seemed true, that the entire world is true. Whereas Miranda puts it in Shakespeare's The Tempest, "Oh brave new world that has such creatures in it," to paraphrase. And it was the sense that there was something raw and real that was there. And that the friends of mine I knew who were going to church all the time were not taking that step. They were going to church and they were hearing about angels and they were hearing about demons and this whole spiritual world populated and run through with all sorts of invisible creatures that were there. But they would leave church and none of that mattered anymore. And it was like, but I thought you said the world's full of angels and the world's full of demons. It's all this stuff. So why aren't you doing anything about that? How does that not fascinate you? And for me, I couldn't shake that fascination. Um, so once I learned, ways people said this is how you can call on spirits of the land around you, I went and gave it a try and got a response. Seemed to get a response, and that was it for me. Um, I was hooked after that, and I wanted to dive as deeply into that as I could. Um, I wanted the rawness of it. I wanted the sense of. Have you guys ever seen Highlander? The movie Highlander?
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the scene where Ramirez there, Sean Connery is teaching Connor about the quickening, and they're on the beach, and he sees the stag, the deer, and he says, "Feel him." He starts pawing at the ground, feel his blood pumping, his heart racing, and suddenly they just start to run. They're overcome with that raw spirit of the wild, and they start running like the stag does. It was that sense of a raw connection to the world that I think we lose when we're living in suburbs, we're living in cities. Um, the same way that we've lost a connection to the cycle of death because we don't have to face the animals we kill every day for our food, as we talked about earlier, we lose a raw connection to nature. When we're not out part of it, we're not subject to its whims. All that happened for me was my idea of nature got broader. Instead of just being the trees and the rocks and the animals, there were spirits behind all of that. And yeah, I couldn't get that out of my heart. That just seemed so naturally true and so naturally real that it deeply coiled itself into me and just became part of what I do, part of my approach to the world.
I'm sold.
Sold.
What was your favorite Greek god at age 7?
At age 7, I was Hades.
Ah, me
Had to be
too.
Hades. Had to
Me
be the,
too.
you know, it had to be the badass. But Hades for me was a tragic figure. Now I'm a romantic at heart. I've always been a romantic at heart, but I love the tragic romance, right? If you've ever read or seen an adaptation of Wuthering Heights, Heathcliff just going nuts over love. There's an appeal. There's a certain appeal to going absolutely insane and turning into a monster over love. There's a certain weird appeal to that. That's a good one. But for me, it was Hades and the myth of Persephone.
Ah,
Because the later telling of the myth is he goes and he kidnaps her and he drags her under the ground. All this crap comes. But the earlier myths, there was no kidnapping. It was far more the agency of Persephone was more present. Very much a choice to be there. Um, so that idea of that tragic love that he had that drove him to madness in these ways, or Persephone loving this person so much that she's going to go to the land of the dead and not care that her mother's causing winter in her grief and being like, it is what it is. Guess y'all going to have to learn how to navigate that winter. And if you don't, we'll see you down here in the underworld soon enough, right? Um, but that figure of Hades was always very, very interesting to me and very compelling to me, especially because he's not the god of death; he's the god of the dead. And there's a distinction there because the Greeks had Thanatos as the god of death, so they made a distinction, which I thought was really interesting. And of course, we get to Thanos and Marvel being a direct crib off of that. Um, so it was that kind of gave me an introduction, just the nature of Hades and the character of Hades to the flexibility and the depth of Greek myth. Um, there's a great joke in Mel Brooks' History of the World, Part One, where he's a Roman. He's talking about this new religion, the Christians. He says these Christians, they're so poor they only got one God, and always gave me a real chuckle, right? So, but yeah, it's the riches. Hades was definitely a draw for me.
you mentioned Hades and Persephone, and that's honestly what I liked about Hades Town is that they start with the telling of how Hades wooed Persephone and she comes down willingly to see him. And they do have love, and even though their love is strained in the play, there are glimpses of the love that they had for each other, and then him kind of backing down to her because of the love that he still has for her. And that entire song he sings, like, I
Right,
built this all for you. And oh, I love that.
right.
And the idea that people have a misconception that Hades and the underworld is hell, it's tortured souls. That's not what the underworld is. It's all souls that have
No,
moved
not at
on.
all.
So yeah.
Right, right. The torture's in Tartarus,
Yep.
but the poetry to the torture You know, even some of it's influenced our language. So Tantalus, such a dick in life. So he's standing in water up to his mid chest. He's always thirsty. When he leans to drink it, the water recedes, and grapes hanging in front of him. When he tries to bite into them, they move. And that's where we get the English word tantalizing, based in his name. Or Sisyphus pushing the boulder up the hill, being the original Rolling Stone. He'll still be there whenever Keith Richards finally ends up. There. Yeah, Tartarus for that, but the underworld being everybody.
Yeah, he's just the keeper of all souls.
Right, right, exactly that. And that was just a thing that moved me as a kid too. That very concept that he has all souls. So not having grown up in the church, but knowing Halloween was also called All Souls Night and All Hallows Eve was like, oh, that's like Hades. Here it is, we're all being creepy. We're being ghosts and goblins and spooky little things. That's really underworld like. All souls will go to him. Maybe that's that. Of course, that's not where Halloween comes from. But when you're 7 or 8 years old, there's magic and mystery to your assumptions and your flashes of insight, even if they're incorrect.
I'm gonna start calling it Hades Eve.
Hades Eve, all Hades Eve.
All Hades Eve.
But yeah, it's the world is a rich and a fascinating and a diverse place. I think it was W.B. Yeats who wrote in a poem that there are more things in this world than we could possibly understand, more things between heaven and earth than are dreamed of in our sad philosophies. Um, and that is part of what fascinates me so much about these magical traditions because they all involve dealing with the spiritual world to one degree or another, be it through witchcraft, be it through Haitian voodoo, the grimoire magic of the Key of Solomon or the Grand Grimoire, things like that, and that raw fascination of being able to punch through, to touch something more, something beyond what we can see with our physical senses, has always really really moved me, and I think it does most serious practitioners as well. And then once you get that first success, Aleister Crowley said that there was a certain satisfaction of being bashed over the head by a spirit of whose existence you were unsure. And I think that takes a certain mentality to experience that and say, "Oh hell yeah, I'm going to run right towards that," instead of running the other way. I guess we're all fools in that sense, or fools rush in where angels feel or fear to tread. Um, I guess there's a level of that foolhardy is foolhardy. You know what the word I mean? Foolhardy ishness. I guess there's a level of that to all of us, and yet we pull out the tarot cards, and the first card in the deck when you lay it down is the Fool, right? Who's stepping out off that cliff, staring up into the sky, blinded by the light of heavens, but stepping right off that cliff into wild adventure. And I think that's really at the heart of a lot of these spiritual traditions as well, is that quest for something more and that wild abandon to it. Um, Even in ancient Greece, once again, you had women who were devotees of Dionysus. The story was that they would be terrifying. They would get drunk and ravage their way across the countryside and rip and rend, and the men would all hide. A little bit terrified. But yeah, that reckless abandon. And I think that appeals to all of us to some degree. Um, to step out of the safety in the quest for kind of ultimate freedom.
Do you find it difficult to there's a community, there's people who come to witchcraft in their own time, in their own way. Do you ever find it difficult um, to work with other people that are, I mean, because they read different books, they have different ways of doing things. Is there ever like friction with that, or are you guys all on the same page?
Absolutely. Oh no, not at all. If you got a 2,000 page book and gave us each a page, we still would never be able to agree on the same page. Um, a lot of these things are highly individual. When you're within a particular tradition, there's certain teachings and certain guidelines and such that are there. In the same way, if you're a doctor, a lawyer, a police officer, there's certain rules and expectations. But when it gets into the magical practice of it, whereas we may draw upon the same sources, such as the Key of Solomon for ceremonial magic, or the Lesser Key, the Grand Grimoire, things like that, each person is different and we aim at different things. We have different motivations within us for why we're doing what we're doing. We have different end goals we have in mind. And then we have different levels of devotions. To some folks, a practice of a very neo-pagan witchcraft is simply celebrating the seasons, celebrating the lunar cycles. That is what they need, and that's good. And then for other folks, it's like no matter how many spirits they call upon or how much they do or how deep they go into it, they always want that next level of depth. They're always pushing more and more and more. Um, so you tend to get those two groups not always seeing eye to eye. Not that anybody's wrong or anybody's more right. It's just that people have their own orientation, their own path to walk through these things, and they don't always mesh. In the same way that human relationships don't always mesh. People are different. Person A and person B may click perfectly. Person A and person C may hate each other on sight, but person B and person C may mesh. So there can be a lot of arguments. We call them witch wars a lot of the time. And you do tend to get ego involved where some people get really edge lordy and decide that, what they do is so wild and so raw and so visceral or so rooted in ancient traditions or so rooted in this or rooted in that other people are just, posers. Some people get that attitude and it comes up. But I mean, you find that in the fandom for just about every kind of sci-fi or horror movie that's out there too. Even music. Oh, you're wearing an Iron Maiden shirt. Name 5 songs, right? Prove your worthiness, to wear that shirt. So that same attitude, that same tribalism, and that same idea to elevate oneself that's rooted in ego can pop up in these traditions too.
You've mentioned the Lesser Key of Solomon a few times, and our only familiarity with that is the use of it for like demon summoning and evocation. When you're using it for witchcraft and practitioner, what is the purpose?
So with the Lesser Key of Solomon, what it is, it's based around magical legends around the biblical King Solomon. The idea being that he created a brass vessel and he sealed these 72 spirits into it. And then once he had them imprisoned, he could command them to do things and all these sorts. But he built the temple in Israel, overnight by using these demons to do it, all that sort of thing. So each of those particular spirits has um, its own focus, its own things that it does. So the lesser key will say this particular demon is a great duke, and he teaches of astrology and herbs, for example. Or this one gives the power to move about without being seen, or so on. So they each have their own particular focus. Um, so working with them is meant to access the abilities they have and leverage their abilities in the same way that if you're feeling sick, you call a doctor. But if you're having legal problems, you call a lawyer, right? If you're looking to build a house, you call a contractor or an architect. So each one of those people has their own focus and their own skill set. Working with these spirits is the same. But that's also where the interaction with Christianity comes into it because we have the word demon is very loaded for us. We understand that demon is automatically an evil thing. Um, but most in the ancient world, it wasn't a category like that, where it's like there are automatically evil creatures and automatically good. And there's a very stark, clear dividing line between them. You're one or the other. Um, the spiritual world doesn't work like the Lord of the Rings, where beautiful is automatically good and ugly is automatically evil, and it's very obvious who's good and who's bad. It's more like Game of Thrones, where you watch it one episode, you're thinking Tyrion, what a son of a bitch. And the next episode, you're like, I totally get why he did what he did. And every character has that kind of moral grayness because they're rich, they have depth to them. And you can't wholly call any character in a good or evil in Game of Thrones. Well, it's an occasional evil one. But generally speaking, most of the characters are just complex. They're not good or bad. They're just who they are. And so these spirits are the same. So demon isn't really a great name to use for them, even though it's what the book will use. So I try to use the word spirit more often and hope that it's a bit less loaded. But yeah, that's why we approach them, because they each have their own skill set. We have to build those relationships, and then we attempt to leverage them for those particular benefits.
Is there a specific one that you tend to work with more than others, or does it just kind of oscillate as you're trying to tackle different topics?
Well, with a system like the lesser key, you're supposed to have all of these spirits. wrapped up into this particular brass vessel, so they're there at your beck and call. Well, beck and call is a horrible way to put it. Um, but there are particular ones that I have a love for. There's one named Visaggio. Because Visaggio is a spirit who is associated a lot with healing. Um, and to give you an example, the key will talk about these things in high fluting ways. They call Visaggio a prince of a good nature who rules 26 legions of spirits. Will tell of past and future events and can also locate lost objects, things like that. But for some reason, since I was young, Visaggio appealed to me, largely because he had an association, some other grimoires for healing. Another one by the name of Marbas, who often appears with like the head of a lion, is associated with healing as well. Um, because of my own background, I worked in healthcare for 15 years, and I transitioned over to working for the government here, and I deal a lot with programs that are based on healing, um, based on compensation for healing. My master's thesis dealt with the reclamation of traditional healing knowledge among Indigenous people in Canada. So that focus on healing has always been important to me. So I tend to have a greater attraction towards spirits who are focused that way and are focused on healing, whether it's pharmacologically through herbalism, whether it's affecting magical or miraculous cures. Uh, and I think part of that also goes to my family background. As I mentioned, my grandfather died of dementia. My father had dementia, so I look at situations like that as well that seem hopeless. And that's where I think most people come seeking miracles in life is healing. We look at traditions of miracles in the church, and they're almost always about healing. Somebody went to this, the shrine of some saint, and suddenly was cured of their blindness, or they cast away their crutch and were able to walk. Um, and I think that need for healing connects all the way back to what we were saying at the beginning about the fear of death. Because I think all fear is ultimately rooted in the fear of death. So it comes back to that need of healing being a way we have to stave off facing that inevitable. Um, so for me, it's a draw towards healing spirits, and as I go through life, it's not necessary. It's no longer about a fear of death, because I face that and I feel done pretty well confronting that and accepting it. But rather now for me, it's a fear of what I might call a meaningless death. Of laying in a hospital bed, unable to remember who I am, like my father did, like my grandfather did. Not wanting to live through that, but rather the ability to face death in a better way, and that I think is a sense of healing as well. It's a healing of that primal fear we have of death. Just looking at death as being not just biological ending, but the ending of who I am.
When you're working with these individual 72 spirits of the lesser key, when you're utilizing their knowledge or their skill sets, like for example, the healing entities, is this something specifically that you use for yourself, or is it something that you can use to others or use for others?
Most often, I find the work I do is for other people, both on the witchcraft side of things and the ceremonial magical elements I do, and on the voodoo side of things. Um, it is chiefly for people. And when you look historically at what practitioners did, a lot of their practice was focused on others. So you always read about old cunning men and cunning women in the British countryside. They knew how to stop bleeding. You could be bleeding and they had a charm that they could speak that would stop that bleeding. They knew how to break fevers. So that element of healing was always there. But of course, the flip side to that is the difference between a cure and a poison is dosage, you know? Um, and that's kind of an element that's naturally part of witchcraft, right? The same herbs you can use to heal can injure or kill. Um, and that I think is part of the fear that got instilled in people about that. But it's the same with your physician. Your physician knows how to prescribe you something to you, but he gives you a proper dosage that's not going to hurt you. But then you get those gigantic lists of warnings that come with your medicine. But, this is very good for you, but don't take too much, or flip the page and read the next 16 things that could happen, or after that. The TV commercials, take this, it'll help with your blood pressure. Here are the possible side effects, and that's longer than the actual commercial was. Those elements are there. So there's always been this tradition of healing that's present, always been a tradition of service that needs to be given to the community around you, the people around you, when you're involved in practicing these things. Otherwise, you lose half the point of it. Cultures have always had their own folks appointed who interact with the spiritual world, whose job is to bring these gifts and these benefits in, whether it's a shaman in Siberia who carries the will of the spirits and interprets and gives divination, who calls her mambos in Haiti, witches of whatever culture, around the world, medicine men and indigenous communities. Um, but those roles are always focused and centered on community. Even though these individuals may be outcasts and live at the fringe of the community, they're still there, and people will still go off to them and sneak off to them when they need that help. You know, so I think that's key to it. Is what are we doing if we're not using the knowledge or the skills we gain, leveraging the spiritual relationships we build? If we're not helping other people, what really are we doing?
You mentioned something about in your area, the types of specific routes that you can use. Are there specific things that people look for specifically to what are the ailments that they're trying to get help with? Like any specific things that you've dealt with recently?
Well, a lot of what I deal with are more emotional and psychological injuries these days. So we have a well-developed medical system and people trust it. So you have a headache, migraines that won't go away. People go and they see their doctor. A lot of what I'm dealing with now are people's need for emotional wound healing. Damage after relationships have fallen apart. A need for spiritual healing when there's a deep sense of a lack of connection, no longer feeling part of anything. The color's gone out of life, or food and wine have no taste, as Brad Pitt put in an interview with the vampire. Um, but that's also been something that's been key to indigenous ways of knowing around the world. That's sort of the heart of these magical traditions, that humans have a physical body and a non-physical body. Usually a series of like Russian nesting dolls. There's a physical body, there's a spiritual body, there's usually an astral or mental body in between. And you can be wounded on each one of these levels. And thus you can be treated on the level that's been wounded. Um, so the medical system that we have today is purely mechanistic. It views the human body as a machine. Everything about you is connected to the physicality, and that's it. So the medical community feels there has to be a physical cure for everything. We overprescribe psychological medicines these days because we assume there has to be a physical solution to every issue. Um, Even though throughout most of human history and around the world, we've recognized psychological injuries as being part of a different level of being. So there's not necessarily a physical cure, but there's a psychological one. The easiest example of that for Westerners to understand is exorcism. So throughout the history of the church, in that we look at certain symptoms as it would be labeled demonic possession, and there would be an exorcism conducted to help. Um, and you have all these reports of it being successful. Now, in the modern world, we say, it's a placebo effect. It has to be because we can't accept scientifically a spiritual world, a spiritual dimension to things. But in the end, whether it's a placebo thing or whether it's legitimately casting out a demon, doesn't matter if the patient gets better. Isn't the end result what's important? This person's no longer plagued by these symptoms. So, yeah, most of what I deal with these days is on that psychological level, or on that spiritual level of injury for people, and less so the physical. Although, we can certainly help with physical ailments too. I mean, willow leaves. If I get a headache, just because my stomach's a bit sensitive to aspirin and such, I like to go grab leaves off the willow tree that's out back, because willow leaves have some of the same active ingredients in them naturally as aspirin does. So it's a bit softer on my stomach. Chew those.
First of all, thank you for sharing all of this. I really just, we learn so much when you're on, and I appreciate your willingness to discuss all of these topics and just go with wherever the conversation goes. So thank you for that. And speaking of going where the conversation goes, you mentioned before we hit record that up where you live, there was actually an extraterrestrial phenomenon that occurred. Would you like to share that with us?
Absolutely. So for those listeners who don't know, I live in Nova Scotia, in the east of Canada. And about 40 minutes away from where I am, there's a little place called Shag Harbor, which is going to be a hilarious name to your British listeners. Um, but in October of 67, there was a plane. We had an airplane coming in, um, flying from Halifax Airport towards Toronto. And as they were passing over, they spotted something outside the window that came up alongside of them and kept pace with the plane. And the typical thing, nothing showing up on radar. They could see it. It was following a parallel course. It was described as brilliantly lit and rectangular with a string of smaller lights following it. Um, and then they reported a small explosion near it that didn't make a sound. And then there was the second one that faded away to like a cloud around it and it disappeared. So folks who were living on the coast down here saw it. It wasn't just the folks in the plane. Um, so they call it the Shag Harbor UFO incident. And there was sightings of it all along the coast down here. So in this little town of Shag Harbor, there's a whole UFO center devoted to it. It's got obviously nowhere near as famous as Roswell, but we've had that up here too. And one of the things I personally find fascinating about this, just in terms of human beings and the way we are, is we used to talk all the time about seeing fairies, seeing spirits in the woods, seeing elves, brownies, beasties and ghosts and goblins. And then we stopped seeing them. We started seeing things in the sky. And that seemed to start happening once we discovered flight. And once human beings were no longer earthbound and we could fly, we started looking up and seeing things there instead. So I'm always quite curious about that particular dimension to it. But Shag Harbor, yeah. Um, as you approach the town, it's got the sign up, home of the Shag Harbor incident in 1967, which is kind of a local thing. But Nova Scotia is a mysterious place. If you've ever seen the Oak Island mystery, they did documentaries and that's just up the coast for me as well. The whole supposed Templar treasure and all that is here. We have Dagger Woods up on the other end of the province with a famous creature called the Howler that supposedly lives out in the woods that we've had reports on for hundreds of years. It's a magical place here.
Being that you work in the woods a lot with finding, the different things you need for your spiritual practices, do you experience anything from the Fae kind of realm or anything else that might not be the typical?
Absolutely. And I find that these things tend to approach you the more you get into them. Like it's almost like you got a bat signal strapped to you, practitioner coming, right? Um, so I've heard drumming when I've been out in the woods. I've been sure when I'm hearing this drumming, okay, it's just over there. There must be some folks camping out or whatever. And you walk towards the spot, and as you get close to where the drumming is, suddenly it's coming from behind you now from 200 feet away. Like it leaps, it moves. It doesn't stay where you are, and as you get close to it, it suddenly moves. And when I was first doing these sorts of things, scared the hell out of me, but I had too much pride to run out of the woods. I will strive forward in a stately manner. Um, but now I look forward to them. They very much thrill me when things like that happen. It's an interaction with the spiritual world that I perceive and I notice. Um, and I find it very moving. Or the natural world seems to bend towards it. I was looking for an oak tree for one particular thing. I needed some oak leaves, and I could not find one everywhere I looked, anywhere I looked. And I called out to the spirits I was working with for this particular thing. I said, man, I need oak leaves. You better help me. If you want this done, you better help me find these oak leaves. And I heard this call, and I looked up, and there's a crow, massive crow, sitting there in the tree. And it looked at me, and it started to fly, just going tree to tree. So I followed it. Didn't it go to the one oak tree within about 4 miles? Took me straight to it. Um, so a big part of things like that is skeptics will say, well, that's a coincidence. And practitioners will say, well, it's a coincidence once. But when it happens 10 times, 20 times, 30 times, it ceases to be coincidence. So one of my favorite ways to talk about it is say the difference between an ordinary life and a miraculous life is just how well you pay attention. We are surrounded by these little miracles all the time, especially when we're practitioners. The main difference being we're looking for those miracles, and our interpretive framework accepts the fact that these things that are occurring are not accidental or not necessarily coincidental. Um, So yeah, that's a huge part of it. So I do experience those things, and I relish them every single time. They give me a thrill right down in the cockles of my heart, to use the words of Dennis Leary, and I quite enjoy it every time it occurs.
Gratitude is key, right?
That's it.
And you're not afraid of them. You're not there to hurt them. They're not there to hurt you. You're just there to exist
Right,
among them.
right, right. You're there to do your thing, and of course, there's always the risk. Um, you don't want to offend spirits or piss them off. And not every spirit that's out there wants to deal with humans. Some of them don't particularly like us. Some of them are just completely uninterested in us. Some can be actively malicious, just depending on the nature of the spirit. And you find that in mythologies all around the world too. You'll find, going back to the Greek myths, you start to read about this creature or that creature, a Hydra or the Nemean lion or something like that. That's not looking to be friends with anybody, but certainly wants to give you a whooping if it sees you. In North America, we have, legends of the Wendigo and things like that. There are creatures out there that simply don't want to deal with us. That one I mentioned up in Dagger Woods here, the Howler. The story being that, people would walk through the woods at night, they'd start to hear this howl in the distance. It got closer and closer. Didn't sound like a wolf, didn't sound like a coyote, didn't sound anything natural. But it would suddenly sound half a mile away, and then the next howl, like 10 seconds later, it sounded like 40 feet away, which led to people running their butts out of the woods real quick. Um, but the story of the Howler of Dagger Woods, is a thing there too. So that's a spirit that clearly doesn't want people around.
Yeah, no longer walking in a stately manner.
Right, no longer walking in a stately manner is true. Um, so yeah, it's I'm not out there looking to offend or cause problems with these spirits, but the same way we deal with natural animals out there, you may come across a wolf out in the woods, and the wolf looks at you. You look at it, and it just turns and walks away, and you go, "Okay, great." Another time, you may come across that wolf, and it says, "Hey, buddy, I'm a little hungry, and you're looking pretty good." And the situation gets a little different. So you walk carefully. And you carry a big stick, hopefully with a goat skull tied to it, and you see what you can do, right? But that is a beautiful part of it. Going back out there and facing the rawness of the natural world, as we talked about earlier, the way our ancestors faced death in a more visceral way, in a more daily fashion, and it's not something that we face today. Um, we also we've cut ourselves off from the natural world in a lot of ways. I live in a house, and when it rains outside, I don't get wet. When the wind is howling, I don't get cold. I'm in a house. So I'm divided off in that way. I can look out the window and I can see other houses. I'm not deep out in the woods in a little homestead alone, right? I'm less at the mercy of the natural world, and so we divide ourselves and we cut ourselves off from those natural cycles in a real way. So these traditions and these things, they don't allow us that ability to stay cut off. They require our engagement, with the natural world and the land around us. And I think in a very real way that not only hones us in on the lives our ancestors led, but it also reconnects us to the actual raw and visceral nature of what life is. And I think that's a big part of why in The Witch, Black Phillip tells us to live deliciously. You know, uh, it's understand that life is raw and it's bloody and it's painful and it can be horrid in the same way it can be glorious and beautiful and rich. But we have to take it as it comes and accept it in its totality. We're not going to get the joy without the pain. We won't know love without sorrow. We're not going to know peace without strife. So why deny all of life because we don't want to face the messier sides? Sink into it, wrap yourself up in it, right, and live deliciously.
Live deliciously. Thank you so much. This has been amazing. Now, I know people are going to want to know more about what you do, and I'm sure read the articles that you post or the blogs that you post. Where can they find more information about you?
So for me, I have a website called lawandorder.com. That's law is LWA, and then andorder.com. That's my blog based chiefly on Haitian voodoo. But I can be reached through there and be contacted through there. Or I'm on Facebook as Houngan James, Hougan James. Pretty easy to find them there as well. And I encourage anybody who's got questions or wants to talk, and feel free to reach out to me. I'm always happy to talk about these things with folks, not necessarily just with other practitioners, but people who are interested or people who have no interest in practicing, but just curiosity, whatever the only people I don't particularly care to hear from are the ones who are looking to save my soul. So, but other than that, yeah, I encourage anybody to reach out. I'm always happy to speak to people about these things. I'm passionate about it, and I do love sharing this with other people.
Thank you so much. BJ?
No, it's just there's so many things that when you just start talking about your practices and all of the things that you do, there's so many things that I want to know. And so I'm definitely going to be one of those people that researches a little more and may reach out to get some guidance on just a few different things because I like what you mentioned about helping people with psychological, but also it sounds like depression, right? Like I feel like that was one of the things that maybe that you can help people with. But yeah, I'm excited to learn more, and I'm happy you came on again um, today. So thank you.
Please do. I'm happy to talk to either one of you guys anytime. Um, I'm happy to come back and talk about any topics you guys want to discuss. I really enjoy these conversations. You guys are great hosts. It's a natural, easy flow. And I'm a big fan of your podcast as well. So definitely happy to be included. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. And that means a lot. Having these conversations can be, especially topics like this, can be quite eye opening. And also, I know like BJ and I sit here like, oh my gosh, my mind is being blown. And wait, I still have to ask questions. So I'm glad that it feels like such a great flow to you because the information you share and the way you share it is extremely helpful. And you do make conversation on these very big topics super easy to have.
I'm really glad to hear that. Like I said, I'm passionate about it. I do like sharing these things and discussing them. Not all practitioners have the same take on things, so I enjoy those debates that come up with other practitioners as well. Um, it's uh, it's just the thrilling part of life, right? Life is rich, and it is beautiful. It is full of so much amazing wonderment and fascinating things that it's always a joy to share those sorts of things with other people. Um, to provide any advice I can for people who want to get started, debate back and forth with other practitioners, right? Or just talk about these things to people who may have a cursory or passing interest.
That's so great. And yes, we would absolutely love to have you back on anytime.
That sounds fantastic. But just said, I thank you guys for running the podcast. It's one of my favorites. I'm a bit of a podcast addict, but 3Haunted is one of my favorites. It's absolutely fantastic.
I'm gonna turn bright red. All right, BJ, you want to bring us home?
All right. Well, again, thank you for joining us. And for all of our listeners, I'm so happy that we get to do this every single week, talk to people like yourself that can just fill our brains up and make them explode with knowledge. And thank you all for tuning in to this episode of 3Haunted Podcast with your hosts. I'm BJ Segura.
And I'm Ashley Lunar Goddess.
If you have any questions, comments, or episode suggestions, please feel free to email us at 300podcast@gmail.com. If you haven't done so already, please like, follow, and subscribe to all our social media. You don't want to miss our amazing guests like Houngan James.
Also, don't forget to check out 3hauntedpodcast.com, where you'll find all our past and current season episodes, as well as guest information and all kinds of awesome 3 Haunted merch. Until next time.